It's a delight. It's fun to be here. Although I had brought a PowerPoint, and then I talked to Deidre last night, and she sort of said, here, do you know how awful PowerPoints are and the way people use them? And so I got afraid. So I eliminated my PowerPoint, so there's no PowerPoint there because it wasn't up to Deidre's standards. So I'll try and discuss it. And, in many ways, I agree with that. This paper goes back to probably a discussion with David Levy a long, long time ago. We've been friends for quite a while. Why we've been friends, I'm not quite sure, because I guess I am sure. We're both a little bit weird and always asking offbeat questions in there. But, sort of, in looking at some of his work, I asked, what really is your project all about? What are you trying to do? Are you trying to sort of save and bring back classical liberalism? So there's part of that. And, so we talked quite a bit about that. And then, I think he may have accepted that that really is his goal, to sort of bring back classical liberalism. And that's very much what I see my goal as. And so I think we agree very much that there's enormous amounts of insight in classical liberal arguments. And lost on both sides of the political spectrum. I wore my University of Chicago shirt here to cover up that, I'm really a Soros guy in disguise. So, the one at Soros conferences was me. And the one who talks to Kolecki is me. I'm coming from that group. But within that group, I'm a token. I'm their token conservative. One, that they can bring, that they can talk to, and actually have a discussion with. And within conservative groups, I'm the token liberal. But then I noticed they have Michael Perlman here, and so I lose my token, by far, because you have a real one there, as opposed to, sort of me. Sort of where David and I agreed very much. It was always amazing. The things we were working on often paralleled each other, the things we were interested in. He was interested in ethics. I was interested in ethics, coming from quite different positions. Interested in econometrics and sort of what the limits of econometrics. That was another interest of mine, and how those interests sort of followed. And in some ways it followed from that sense that here classical liberals had struggled with problems. Economics had answered them in certain ways that weren't necessarily the best way, but nobody in economics was discussing why that might not be the best way, except for, of course, Deidre, sort of who, again, sort of parallels this set of interests of talking about it, all from quite different perspectives, but really, sort of fitting together in a way that's there. So, as I read the papers that were sent, it seemed to me there was quite a lot of overlap of the questions being asked and the issues being asked. And so, sort of, I thought it fit very well. So it's a delight to be here. What I'm talking about is a paper I did with Craig Freedman. And it's sort of called The Chicago Counter-Revolution and the Loss of the Chicago Liberal Tradition. And counter-revolution is very important because I think you can only understand sort of the Chicago school if you understand that it was a counter-revolution to things that happened within economics. Specifically, sort of what Deidre calls Samuelsonian economics having developed. What I call Walrasian neoclassical economics, sort of learner's approach to thinking here we have a model that will tell us a solution to something. People actually believed that. They believed it strongly in that time. If you read the 50s and 60s in terms of the belief in science that it is going to provide answers, and the sense that economists had at the time that we're going to get answers from these. So it was very much part of the system. I see the Chicago school as a reaction to that thing, and you can't understand it separately from, sort of those historical events. However, the reaction that was there, I see differentiating it from the Chicago tradition, which Jim talked about. Sort of here, there's the old and the new Chicago school. Well, these sort of move back, but the old Chicago school, Simon's Knight, sort of was part of a classical liberal tradition in a quite different sense than the Chicago school was. So that's the argument we're making in trying to sort of draw the distinctions among those. And it comes from sort of my general reading and Craig's a number of interviews that he's done with a lot of Chicago, sort of individuals. Now, Craig, you should know, is a UMass Amherst graduate. So he's, sort of probably, sort of about with Michael Perlman, sort of in terms of overall views. And so what I like is when people with quite different views come together and work together. Because that's what I find, sort of really sort of says, here, we're not drawing this on particular, and I'm afraid to use the word ideological, but ideological positions. What we're saying is there's some issues that go beyond that are part of debate. And so that's really, sort of how we tried to do it. So essentially, let me just go through the basic argument and then discuss, sort of the issues that I think are important. The first is the classical tradition, which started, which I regard, so there's lots of different elements of it. It goes Smith, Ricardo, Mill. I regard Mill as sort of the high point of that classical tradition.
That's right.
Sort of operating within there. And, sort of they had, what distinguishes it to me is its method, which was very important. And also its ideological positions. And ideological in the sense of ideology, here are things that are beyond debate, sort of that here, the importance of the individual. And having to give that. There are certain things that a system has to meet. So they had normative goals. And they were willing to discuss it, but there was a limit beyond which here, so they said it was there. So there was as much discussion as possible. Now within that sense, you had, sort of a long tradition there. That evolved into a neoclassical tradition. And the neoclassical tradition actually, I think, has to be seen as two separate traditions. The first one would be what I call a Marshallian tradition. And that kept the classical method. And I'll talk more about what I mean by the classical method. So in other words, it saw, sort of very much operating within that classical method of, seeing economics as about achieving those goals and talking loosely about things. So if you read, sort of Marshall, he's qualifying everything, and the models fit in the footnotes. Sort of the Chicago tradition sort of followed along that Marshallian tradition, as did a lot of ones that did not. See, I consider Keynes within that classical tradition. That's John Maynard Keynes, I'm saying, is within the classical tradition. And that classical tradition here, we are not relying on science to tell us what it is. It's a set of arguments. It's a practical set of arguments. And I see the general theory as a practical set of arguments. Here's what we have to do to resolve certain problems, which if we don't resolve, people are going to dump the entire system. And the system is too good for that. Now that's debatable, but it's still within that classical tradition. I see Robbins within that classical tradition very much. So when he was defining science, he was defining economics, he was defining the science of economics, not economics. And I think that distinction has been lost a lot. I see Buchanan as very much within that classical tradition, sort of carrying it through. Ronald Coase is there. There's a whole set of people who've done that. That is a very small tradition, and it's been, sort of decreasing. The one that sort of moved out is what I call the Walrasian tradition. And that directly relates theory and models. So the other one sort of does theory, but it's out there, but says here, It doesn't necessarily mean this is what you have to do for policy. Policy is very complicated. You have to discuss policy using models, but not based on models. The Walrasian tradition says you do policy based on models. You move from the model to the policy. And Abba Lerner is probably the best representative of that. And having written with Abba, I know, he's thought of a model, here's a solution, that'll apply. Well, what about some practical problems? Well, don't really worry about them. That's for somebody else to worry about. So the practical problems can get fit there. And within that sense, you have these different movements. Now, the argument is going to be that the Chicago School, what we're calling the Chicago School, which would be the Freedman, sort of Stigler director group, was a reaction to the Lerner type, science there. That in doing that, they accepted, possibly for argumentation's sake, possibly for other reasons, they accepted, sort of the basis of that. Having accepted the basis means they drew away from this classical liberal tradition. And so they lost the classical liberal tradition by sort of accepting the basis of the debate to take place there. And they may have had to do that, because in many ways, sort of it was, sort of that liberal tradition was lost, but they did that. So, so the argument goes back to a big distinction that I make between art of economics and science of economics. So if you look at John Neville Keynes's sort of discussion of methodology, and that was sort of the high point of classical methodology defining it. And all he was trying to do is not to do anything new, but simply sort of put it all together of what classical economics believed. And what he said was, there's positive economics, normative economics. Normative economics is the goals that we should be aiming for. Positive economics is the science of economics. And then there's the art of economics, which is applied economics, which is how do you use the information that we have in the science to achieve what we've determined as the goals. Okay, so here was applied economics. Now, if you think of it, sort of what he was doing was defending it against the historical school, which was arguing there is no science. So he wrote mostly about positive economics, trying to say there is some small area there, but if we were to draw it, here would be his view. Here's the science of economics. Here is the art of economics. And then there's normative economics here. Almost all of economics belonged in the art. There's a small amount of positive economics. This is science. Okay? Everything here is art, and then there's normative sets of issues which he didn't discuss much, which isn't clear how big they should be. So you have those three divisions. Okay? Then you have Marshall coming along. And Marshall is the one who moved away from talking about political economy to economics. So he no longer had that. So now, as opposed to saying here we're political economy, which really emphasized the art of economics, he said it's economics. But what he meant by that was, for Marshall, this positive economics was no longer this little circle, it was a dot. Okay, essentially what he said, it's all practical type of analysis. It's one thing at a time. It's a method. It's not a set of firm doctrines. You can't, so he said this is bigger than what you think. And if you look and read sort of his principles, he always is sort of questioning this, questioning that. There's nothing placed firm on it. And so the science he wanted to say was actually smaller than what J.N. Keynes was arguing. Okay, so you had this larger art of economics, and indeed economics, he didn't want to call this political economy, because he was afraid this would be considered economics. He wanted this called economics because it was the central part of what they were doing. So you had, sort of Marshall coming along, where the art was everything. Now you had some tools there, But the tools were not scientific tools, they were engineering tools that here helped you sort of solve problems, keeping in the back of your mind that these are only tools that you might use, then you use your common sense to see whether they were useful or not. Okay? Now Robbins, sort of came back more to J.N. Keynes's, because Robbins was a classical scholar, and argued more, sort of that here, it isn't this dot. The science of economics is actually something else, bigger. But again, it was a very limited, small set of things, because what were economists doing at the time? They were studying constrained optimization and really seeing important new insights. So here Marshall had said, here you have all kinds of sort of what I'd call sort of basic rules of thumb that had developed. And people were showing analytically here, these rules of thumb wouldn't necessarily work. You started to put it in math, and you saw interrelationships, we can see other things. This study was important. That's what Robbins defined as the science of economics. So when he said the definition of economics, he said very specifically the definition of the science of economics is the study of the allocation of scarce resources among alternative ends. That was simply a discussion of here's what the scientists were doing at the time. They were understanding that and seeing it. Empirical work at that time was almost minimal. So there wasn't one, and he has discussions. At some point in the future, he said it might be there, but it isn't much. So it was just this logical development. For him, he called this political economy. In his Eli lecture in '81, he said he'd been quite misunderstood, that there should be a separate branch talking about policy. This did not talk about policy at all. And that's the key element within the classical methodology. Science was not about policy. Science was about finding the truth, sort of understanding the system for the sake of the system. It was not about policy, and I have quotes in the paper, so where going back to Nassau Senior said, sort of nothing in economics gives one iota of a sense of being able to say anything about policy. Policy belongs to the statesman. Here, the people operating in the art of economics were the ones talking about policy. Why was that? Because economics sort of assumed too many things away that you had to take into account. You had to build in rules. You had to talk about the evolution of rules. You had to build in sociological dimensions. They were very specific that economics is the study of material welfare, not the study of all issues. Within that, and then you could operate. So there was this distinction that they made that they felt was very important, but the science was very small. You didn't draw policy conclusions from it. The art was very big, which meant essentially that here it was all debatable. Science was not debatable. So science was what people who have studied it would agree upon. So there's not debates about science. So here's a constrained optimization model. These are the results. Here you have, some other model. This is the logical result. Don't debate it. It's there. Anybody, who's a scientist would know that. You debate what the implications of that are. For drawing policy conclusions, that's a quite different issue. And they separated those two. Okay, so that was really within the Marshallian, tradition. Then you have the 1930s coming along. And here's where Lerner comes in. And Lerner, in the economics of control, had a different vision. Here was the science of economics. Here was the art of economics. So everything now became, here's part of the science, the model, which means we immediately draw conclusions about policy from the science of economics. And that, around the 1930s, as Walrasian models started to get built in, became the way policy was talked about. So you said, here's the model. It then leads to these policy conclusions, so this is what government should do. Not this might help us sort of understanding what decisions we might make. It was here's the model, here's what government should do. People started talking like that. Now if you read Pigou's, and some of the later papers will show this nicely, if you read Pigou's welfare economics, he was very specific about the limitations. He did not say this is science. Well, he did and didn't. He said this is realistic science, which he differentiated from pure science. And the pure science is what the small thing there. And the realistic science, he wanted to call it science, what I'm calling art. Well, that's fine, I don't care what it's called, but he made very specifically, it's fruit-bearing as opposed to light-bearing. You know, it's about designing policy, so in some ways, I see it much more as engineering. It's about heuristics. Things about the model isn't necessarily true, or anything else. You're using it that is useful. He was working within this Marshallian tradition, because it was very much within that. He was extending that Marshallian tradition. And he placed limitations. So when you read his welfare economics, there's lots of qualifications. Well, if, you know, sort of actual total output is what we want, and it isn't necessarily there, if this, if then this would follow. He also limits and says this may not be, talking about here is worthwhile, but whether the government should enter in isn't clear from this model. Because of course there's all kinds of things I haven't taken into account. So if it had been seen as simply sort of part of this art, here we use some heuristics that might sort of show how economic theory is done, there wouldn't have been any debate. But it started to be used as science. And here, science tells us government should intervene. This was something quite different, that here we're now using sort of the imprimatur of science to say, you know, sort of here, government should enter in. And that sort of provoked, you know, there was a movement, you know, that happened after the war because the government had won World War II. You know, sort of here governments seemed to have solved certain problems that were very serious. And there was a movement towards that, away from this sense that governments can't solve problems because they're too problematic in terms of the collective choice even to define the problem. And sort of that was the sense of laissez-faire. So within that, you know, that Chicago school operated as a reaction to this change. And I think it changed the nature of the way classical liberalism was presented. It became a defender in talking about science, saying the government should not enter. And what I'll be arguing is that's how they presented sort of the argument. So here you have the Pigovian argument that says government should enter. We now will modify Coase, so we'll have the Stigler-Coasian argument that is essentially saying government should never enter. Both are based on assumptions, and of course the art would say economic theory doesn't tell us whether government should or should not enter. That's a matter of very practical decisions about the particular case, and you cannot answer it in general. But both the learner one wanted to answer it in general. Here are the rules that government should follow about policy. And in reaction to that, you had the Freedman-Stigler view. Here are the rules government should follow in reaction to policy. So you had differentiating rules, both operating under science, as opposed to both operating under art. That, in my view, caused a problem because art encourages debate. Art said it really is about the particular instances. You've got to look there, and there's different arguments on both sides. Where does it fit? Take the lighthouse example. You know, so will it fit there, there? You're trying to find a heuristic that will work for particular cases. The other says, here, we know what will work one way or the other. You just simply have to then have the implementation problems. So they're quite different in the approach. Now, the thing I'm working on now is really differentiating the methodology of science, which is all kinds of literature about. and the methodology of engineering, where I've only found one general book that discusses the methodology of engineering, and that's by Billy Von Cohn, sort of who is a nuclear engineer who happened to write about philosophy, sort of that. It's the only one there, and so they, sort of, why engineers don't care about methodology. They do what they do. It's not something of concern. And sort of methodologists haven't studied engineering methodology. Now, there's a lot written on methodology in engineering, but all of it is very particular within chemical engineering, within nuclear engineering. Here are what they call heuristics that solve things. And the difference is, one is about solving problems. So an engineer, he starts with the thing, applied engineering is not applied science. Let me repeat that. Applied engineering is not applied science, or engineering is not applied science. In economics, it would be applied economics is not applied scientific economics. Well, what's the difference? Well, he defines engineering as trying to solve highly uncertain questions to achieve certain ends within scarce resources. See a similarity there? What's the difference? Highly uncertain situations, which means in order to sort of apply science, you have to say what will work, what will fit for this particular element. As you're doing that, you make arbitrary assumptions as you have to, and you call it a heuristic. So he says it's essentially the use of heuristics to solve problems. And the debate is always about what's the best heuristics to have. Now, why isn't it applied science? Because lots of times science doesn't have anything to really share about the issues that are really important. It could be ethical issues. If in order to resolve a problem, you have to answer certain ethical issues, an engineer would come up with, here is a solution to say, here are the ethical views that I'm incorporating in that. A scientist keeps them out. So you will address lots of things. The second one is the level of certainty you will approach something. If you're doing science, you want it at this high degree of certainty. If you're doing engineering, there's the weakest link principle that he discusses. There is no sense carrying an argument further than the weakest link of your argument. And all the effort should go into sort of studying and furthering the weakest link. Now that means if you're unclear what your goals are, how the hell should you spend all kinds of time saying precisely how to achieve the goals? You spend the time trying to devise mechanisms to say, here are the goals that we're actually searching for, that we'd actually do. So if you'd had this sort of thinking of that, economists would have spent a lot more time sort of saying, how do we move from many people having many different goals into sort of something workable as the goal of society? Notice economics, we've avoided all that and said, well, there's some maximizing utility or social welfare. If you say, well, how do you implement that social welfare? What is that? Well, that's really not part of science. It's too imprecise. It would be quite different. Engineering deals with the imprecision because that's where the weakest link often is. And therefore, it will use non-scientific elements all the time. It will use whatever arguments you can. This enters into Deidre's use, of course, the t-statistic and the way you use statistics. Economists will sort of drive things to be so precise where it serves very little purpose in answering the question that one wants. Here, you're making a judgment about a whole variety of things about whether the model fits. Why be that precise about something else? It serves very little purpose in answering the problems. Another difference is it says, here, what precisely are the goals? Notice how little time we've spent. on what are the goals that we're really trying to achieve. Oh, we can say about general goals, but you've got, as an engineer, you've got to make them operational. Now, Amartya Sen has tried to make them operational in capabilities. Now, that one may disagree with that, but that is really sort of an engineering mentality. Try and say, here we're trying to get certain goals that we can put within something that we can talk about, sort of actually achieving. And so it's quite different. The other difference that really comes through by thinking about a methodology of engineering is it includes design. Design is a fundamentally important part of engineering. Notice how little focus there is in economics about design. Now, what do I mean by design? Well, what I mean is, sort of, it goes back again, here is a mechanism that will achieve the certain end. So the work I did with Abel Lerner, where we said here, inflation is a problem. What's the solution to inflation? Well, the solution we had, we need property rights and prices, so that anybody who wants to raise their price has to pay somebody else to lower their price by an offsetting amount. In which case, assume we solve all the problems, you can't have any inflation. There was a design of a system, which one could object to or anything else, but the design then focused the discussion. Not some abstract part, but here's a particular design of what would actually do the solution. So to think of it here, there should be a whole separate branch, as there is in engineering, about abstract designs. And designs within certain constructions that use the market. Here's designs that use government. And here is why neither will work. Well, here's how we can change the structure of the market so it might work better. Here's how we can design the structure of government so it works better. So to say government is going to screw up everything doesn't help anything. Can we design government so that the political forces that are pushing in certain directions will not be strong enough, will be limited to allow a design to deal with rules? That economists would be thinking of those problems much more than they would of abstract, theoretical sets of issues. It's here, can be abstract, but still very much problem-oriented, as opposed to truth-oriented. So if you're differentiating the two, science is the study of things for truth, to understand them. Only truth, forget anything else. That defines it, that's science. Engineering is here how to solve a problem, the study of things as to solve a problem. So it's problem solving. Engineering uses science, but it is not applied science. What I'm calling the art of economics is that engineering branch. It's about problem solving and very specific problem solving. Now, there's many, many different levels at which one can worry about it. Jim's work, I think, is about very much what I call within the engineering sense. It's about problem solving of this meta level of how do we sort of get the right sets of rules in there. And he sort of talked about those problems in ways that other economists haven't touched. And that becomes a very important part of what's going on. So, so that's the general, sort of sense, that distinction that I have, that was I believe, very much part of this classical tradition that has been lost in sort of the movement that went on. Now, within that, classical laissez-faire, the way I interpret classical laissez-faire is a belief, not saying government should never get involved. Otherwise, you take a look at John Stuart Mill, he had all kinds of discussions of, so where government should get involved. But a really serious concern about here are the problems of government involvement. Every time we seem to have it in, this bad stuff happens, or this happens. That means we better figure out a way to change government, or we better sort of stay away. So a concern about government entering in. There was an activist side of laissez-faire and a non-activist side of laissez-faire, which were based on not ideological differential judgments about the market, but practical judgments about how much we can sort of devise limitations on what government will do. So the argument about government involvement or not was not a theoretical argument about the market. It was a practical argument about, sort of how, sort of here in this model, government might serve this purpose, but we know the model doesn't fit. So therefore, sort of where does one come out? So they were about practical implementation problems, much more so than they were about, sort of theoretical issues at all. So within that, the other part of the classical tradition was this sense that how do you define goals? They were very worried about that. And somehow, the best way to define goals is to let individuals define their own goals, as opposed to having anybody tell what those goals are. That became a fundamental premise, that individuals should be allowed to find their own goals. And the structure of the system should be to allow that as much as possible. Now, how and what that means is extraordinarily complicated and deserves lots of discussion. And the liberal tradition that said here, when people are brought up in a way that they have no income or very low income does not allow them sufficient freedom to choose their goals, was a legitimate part of that debate and should be part of that debate. But it's not an argument here, the market or not. It is a discussion about goals and achieving those goals, which becomes very much part of the engineering, the art discussion. It's not part of the science, because there's nothing science can bring to answer that. Just because science can't answer something doesn't mean that society can't answer something. And, really the difference that goes there. So now let me get a little bit, sort of to the paper, or the argument of the paper, which all this is part of it, because, sort of it's the set of arguments that are going on, that you have the Chicago tradition of Knight and Simons, but that tradition was a very open tradition. It said, question everything. Now what happened was, you had a Yale-Harvard nexus at the time. They sort of felt they understood, they were economics. Chicago developed to piss on them, to say, no, you don't really understand. So Veblen, they brought in Veblen. Why? Well, because, he was a pretty good pisser. He would say that essentially, look, this is kind of stupid. It said, challenge everything, and brought in the set of individuals who had that tendency, even if it was themselves, and the set of arguments. So it was here the best way to understand. This was a movement away from the classical tradition within the Millian sense. Mill was always so open to everything and sort of, oh yes, let's talk about it, as opposed to, you're crazy, you don't know what you're saying. Both are reasonable, sort of, and you've got to have both, but they're both consistent, in my view, with the classical tradition. They're just different, aspects of it. One, sort of civil discourse, where everyone knows it's civil and will operate with those set of rules. And the other is uncivil discourse. But everyone knows it's being done to further one's understanding. As you can tell, I favor uncivil discourse. Done within the understanding that I'm not trying to be mean or anything else. I'm trying to understand. And the best way to understand is to push everything I might have as far as I can. And then you push back. And then maybe we arrive at some position where we can agree, but that's one way to agree. If it moves to the point, and this is about ideology, where we can't argue, then it's lost, sort of its civil, uncivil nature. And my sort of discussion, our description of the Chicago tradition is of that, sort of civil, uncivil nature. That was very much part of it. And we talked about that to some degree. And then, so at the time, that was fine because it operated within sort of classical economics, still being Marshallian classical economics. So it was still within, that sense because Marshall, sort of saw it as this engineering art, not about science. As it moved to what I call Lerner, and I use Lerner rather than Samuelson, because Lerner went much further. Sort of his economics of control really made statements, whereas Samuelson modified it. He, so just a brilliant person and able to understand here. He was talking within it. If he had been pushed, I think he would have said, no, there's limits, everything else. Lerner pushed, no. He'd react back, no, there's no limits. This is, sort of the truth of what's going there. So you had that movement that happened, and then welfare economics moved from where I put it with Pigou in the art and engineering into the science. So now economic science was telling people what policy and that government should intervene. It was at this point where I think the Chicago School was born. And we talk about sort of the development of the Chicago School. That sort of was a reaction. It maintained that, react, sort of argue as strong as you can against everything. But it said there's a protective barrier. We have to save the market. Because the science, they're arguing the science of economics says to destroy the market, the only way to counter that is to argue that here the science of economics says don't destroy the market. So we have a counter science. That's when we develop the two ideologies. Neither of which should be seen as ideologies, in my view. They should be seen as arguments about practical problems of implementation. But it was the Chicago School reacting to that, sort of creating, here is, sort of this argument that we have it. Now, the way they did it was really with the Coase's theory. And so here you had Coase, who had sort of said, here's what's wrong with Pigovian economics. And it was, it assumes away transactions costs. And if you have transactions costs here, it all breaks down. But then used it to argue here, the market will solve everything. So the Coase theorem, or what's known as the Coase theorem, which is really Stigler's version of the Coase theorem, essentially said that here, sort of, we can just leave everything to the market. Of course, the market has transactions costs. What Coase was saying, and he's clear about this in a number of things, and I think a couple of papers point that out, is here when there's transaction costs, that framework doesn't answer anything. That's fine within the engineering sense. It never should have been answering anything. It gave us some insight into how to think about things, but not answering them. But now you had this two different elements, and that became what we said is the Chicago School. Now that was combined with sort of the movement into empirical economics and the improvement in statistics, which sort of allowed this change to occur because people could now say, here, econometrics is going to provide the connection between science and policy. Of course, econometrics was nowhere close or near enough to do any of that on either the micro side or the macro side. But it let people sort of have that pretension, and positive economics was very much about, here, this empirical stuff will resolve the problems. So that's how they, sort of worked it in, that fit within sort of the general mood of the time. The classical liberal position, which of course John Maynard Keynes supported too, was econometrics is not going to answer it. Because the issues are too much involved with too many different complicated goals that sort of have to be defined, that to say here, how is econometrics going to answer all this interrelationship that goes on, even without the imprecision of goals, But the, you know, just the limitations of data and everything else, it doesn't resolve the problem. And so you have, you know, sort of this Chicago school developed. And sort of then, you know, when Freedman and Stigler died, Chicago sort of evolved into something almost identical to the others. Started to use the same, you know, sort of here the technical stuff. And the classical liberal tradition was lost almost completely at Chicago. It was maintained, however, by Ronald Coase and Jim Buchanan. And we conclude the paper by arguing that they are really, you know, the individuals who are carrying through the Chicago tradition. And that tradition needs to be expanded much more. So, thanks.
I'm sure there will be comments and discussion. Start here.
Well, that was extremely persuasive. I was at Chicago on the faculty from 1968 to 80, and your remark that the trick was to push as far as you can is very accurate. The Iowa workshop across the Midway at the law school was about they went about as far as they could go, and there's this odd sense in which it was a school because they loved each other, so that they could argue with each other quite violently, and yet not cry. One time, actually, George Stigler, who set the tone for that seminar, actually made an associate professor from Cornell, a man, weep. He had to go out into the hall and cry. But we at Chicago, we didn't cry.
Real men don't cry.
Cry in Chicago school. But I think it was awful in lots of ways, but as you suggest, we believe that it was scientifically productive. But I quarrel with the underlying premise of your argument that there really is a distinction between engineering and science. Now, I understand that your reporting on the attitudes of people in the early and mid 20th century. But if you had to summarize science studies since Thomas Kuhn or Michael Polanyi, Carl's smart brother, in one sentence, it would be, scientists are human, and humans persuade. So it's a rhetorical view. I was not ever able to get Tom Kuhn to agree to use the word, but everything he wrote is of this character. So there's this contrasting talk between pragmatic uncertainty and truth with a capital T, which is certitude. And in Aristotle, it's the distinction between an enthymeme and a syllogism. And also in Aristotle, and in the ancient Greeks generally, it's this distinction between rhetoric and logic. But I think that to think that there I don't accept the distinction. I think that even in mathematics, persuasion reigns. I think you're hung up, as those people were, on the science word. And the science word is peculiar to English. In Italian, for example, a mom will call her scholarly 8-year-old boy mio scienziato, my scientist, which makes no sense in English. What science means in English before the middle of the 19th century is what it means in every other language I've looked into: systematic inquiry. So I just don't. I don't think you're here to sort of summarize. I don't think the paper has taken on board the late 20th century's view of science.
I think it has. And I think, sort of, again, it's this crazy engineer from Texas, speaks with a southern accent and everything else, talking about it. And, sort of, he said essentially that, sort of his engineering methodology that he's talking about is actually, he's extended it and talked to philosophy departments as the universal method. And it's the universal method of which greater than science. And so here, sort of here, science is a heuristic, is his argument. Science being a heuristic in which the goal of, science is the set of heuristics we've accepted to solve truth. That's very postmodern and operates. Engineering is a different heuristic. And so he differentiates science and engineering as they're different heuristics of this broader universal heuristic. And the universal heuristic is one that's very consistent with, what you're saying is 20th century.
Okay, fair enough. So it's in other words, the universal framework is not philosophical truth, geometric
Absolutely.
truth, but the law courts, assemblies,
Yes.
public opinion, scientific opinion, in short, rhetoric.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I think there's a close agreement there.
No, but still, I also believe that your distinction between science and art is a deeply modernist distinction, but perhaps we can come back to it. 2 points, a historical point and a general point. The historical point is, I don't think that economics after the Second World War was the conflation of science and art, that it messed up middle, so to speak. But to the contrary, I think they separated science and art as economists had never done before. Because otherwise, you overstate, I think, the case of Lerner. It wasn't Lerner, it was Samuelson, and it was Kaulitz, and it was Koopmans.
Yeah.
And they strictly separated science and art. That was, for this reason also, math became so popular after the Second World War. And this distinguishes also Lerner from the Kaulitz sort of economic theory. And so given this case, what perhaps historically is not really explained then in your narrative is that later on in the 80s, the variation kind of economics again came to be associated with the proof of the Smithian invisible hand. So this would be the final point of your paper to show what is the Chicago contribution to this conflation at the end, that Walras could be written on the flag of Smith again. But this perhaps only as a complication of the first general historical point, that it was not the conflation of science and art after the Second World War, but the separation of it against the Lerner kind. Because what they needed was a depoliticization of Walras after the Second World And this is what also I think made possible to
I think I'm not.
neoclassical synthesis. The more general point is, if you construct the history of economics on the basis of this, reconstruct it on the basis of this distinction between science and art, I think what you're missing is there is some sort of inherent tendency that once you distinguish science and art, and even if you emphasize, as Mill did, that you should consider both aspects, science and art, but keep them separate. Somehow there is an inherent tendency that it establishes epistemological hierarchy, that science somehow is superior to art. And this is exactly what happened. And I think it is in this sense, it was in the spirit of Mill that science and art became separate in the sense of we economists, we deal with science, other people in think tanks or somewhere, they deal with art. And I think this is the fatal distinction of the tragedy of the Millian distinction between science and art, that it resulted in a division of labor between scientists and the artists, and not in this, we have to accept both aspects.
Yeah, no, it was much more that they accepted, economists started seeing themselves as scientists and talking about policy. And I'm saying, so when that started happening, so that they saw themselves as scientists talking about policy, then you conflated, sort of art and science. It isn't here, so this is the practical implementation, which I agree, sort of people talk about that. That was the engineering. That isn't it at all. The engineering goes back, here is the general framework you're using to approach the problem. And that is an art itself. When they stopped seeing that as an art, that was a distinction to me. Now, Chicago and the Walrasian, there's all kinds of different elements of Walras, and so there's the general equilibrium of De Brugge. Of course, De Brugge was very clear that it had no relevance at all for any policy. It wasn't proving, sort of the invisible hand or anything else. It was, sort of solving a, particular problem that may, is a logical problem that may or may not be useful or have any implications for policy whatsoever. So that's quite different, sort of than saying here we can put these lists of general equations down and solve them and say here we can tell government you should be equating this set of, sort of marginal conditions and that set of marginal conditions. So those are fundamentally, different elements, and I think that's what Lerner did. And Samuelson, I think, was more careful about it. But if you see what people took away from studying, sort of what he did, less careful people did not, sort of draw the distinction and were pulled. He allowed people to sort of say this is science and telling us what we should do. And so I think Samuelson was more limited than Lerner. But I think, it's the learner that, sort of here, this model is telling us that sort of set the tone.
Dan Emmons. David, I'd like to go back to the paper and your distinction between old and new Chicago. One of the examples you give of the new Chicago way of deriving policy conclusions from theory is the Coase theorem. Well, the Coase's visit to Chicago was not until 1960. So this use of the Coase theorem to say that markets work everywhere and at all levels had to be after 1960. The lectures that became Capitalism and Freedom were written and delivered in the 1950s. So my question is, would you put Capitalism and Freedom in old Chicago or new Chicago?
Again, I think new Chicago was developing its views and looking for some argument to have. And so I think what happened was, you had this time, how do we defend and save, sort of liberalism? How do we save the market? Where people were looking for that. And they were looking for anything. And first they thought, here, we will argue against, use the framework. So I agree. Stiegler used, sort of the Pigovian framework. And so that seminar, when Coase came, everybody was arguing in favor of Pigou, that here's the framework we're using. When they saw it, everyone came out there. They were looking for something. So before that time, they were trying to sort of develop it, but it hadn't coalesced. They hadn't seen exactly how they were going to develop, and it was evolving as a school. So it developed here. We know we're saving the market, a belief in that. The question is, we will choose our theory according to that which will save the market. And when we find a better theory that will save the market better, we will adopt it. So I don't see that as inconsistent with my argument. It was simply, yes, once they found the Coase theorem, I probably should have been a little clearer that it wasn't, you know, sort of the Coase theorem that did it. That wasn't any revelation for them. It was much more, here is something we can use to make the argument we want to make and convince people of what we need to convince them of, which is to save the market. And Jim Buchanan has this wonderful discussion with Nutter, you know, sort of there, who sort of said, we've lost the policy debate. Now we've got to save the books. You know, so that's really, you know, what the focus had to be. And there was a sense of loss and the need to sort of operate there. And I think, you know, it really was, how do we save this? It's, you know, what they knew deep down inside, I don't know. But it justifies, in my mind, the hard line that they took, because they were, in their view, achieving the greater end of what they saw as the greater end. So, you know, I'm not questioning their motives. I am questioning, you know, sort of that track in the debate that moved and said, here, it's, you know, not about theory. That's not where economists differ. It's not in science where we differ. It's different in judgments about ethics. These are judgments that people will differ on. And hell, we should, as economists, be discussing that. As scientists, we shouldn't be discussing that. And to think of ourselves as science, you know, is important. And the reason I think the distinction between art and science, or engineering and science, is so important is not what the terms are. I don't give a damn what you could call it, realistic science. But that they have different methodologies and different teaching strategies of what you teach and what you do. And that is the only reason. So it's the practical outcome of here is a different strategy we use of what to teach. I see what we believe, and my focus is really on pedagogy and teaching. We should be teaching people to be problem solvers, not seekers of truth. They should seek truth, fine, in sciences, but a small number of people should. But most of the people we teach are not going to be moving at that level, are not going to get enough into the scientific, you know, sort of heuristic to really understand what those issues are. That's a small group of people. Almost all people will have to solve problems. And that's a quite different methodology and a quite different focus of teaching.
Can I just ask a quick follow-up question to that rather than
Very quickly,
follow the rule?
because I've got a bit of a line.
What are the implications for pedagogy of that in terms of how we create the taxonomy of course structure? For example, would you not be willing to call that problem-solving capability that we desire to teach students economics? Would we call it something else?
I, again, am arguing for a leadership program, but essentially,
We're here.
that essentially, you know, sort of at this point, probably we do much better of combining all the social sciences together and teaching social science first.
Okay.
As opposed to economics first. That there's a core of social science that brings lots of issues together. And we now have the technical structure to do it. So I have a paper, 2 papers on it, both for graduate school and undergraduate school, that here, you know, that core should include 1 philosophy course that raises it, 2 mathematical courses, 1 on game theory and 1 on complex modeling, to sort of understand, you know, so how you formally model something. And the other, you know, so on practical implementation and sets of things. And that should be a core for everybody. Then they can go into something else.
Thank you very much.
I liked your beginning with the 3 circles.
Uh-oh.
But all the rest.
And the transition to the smaller middle circle of art and the expansion of the larger, of the small circle of science. In the process, however, a lot of stuff is lost. I just finished a book called The Invisible Handcuffs, and the central idea was that by just looking at transactions, the economists lost sight of very, very important elements of the economy. In particular, I looked at the exclusion of work, workers, and working conditions. And the subtitle is How Market Tyranny Stifles the Economy by Stunting Labor. Now, in the book, I looked at the way that economists were reprimanded for going back into that larger art cycle. And I used the example of Stigler and Leibenstein. David's seen the paper and helped me with it. Stigler was went absolutely bananas with that and started talking really irrational stuff. So, for example, in explaining X inefficiency, he said, well, you're not taking into consideration the health and welfare of the managers. Crazy. It was like he was sacrificing one pawn to save the queen of the social sciences. But that loss of richness in the larger circle means that the policy recommendations are much more likely to be wrong. So in a sense, we become an anti-science.
I don't see anything contradicting to what I said there. That larger circle of art is mostly, in J.N. Keynes's work, mostly non-economic and raises lots of issues. So it's that larger amount that is the reason to move away from just economics into something that raises the broader issues. Now, within that, you can have a subset of art, economic art, but then you have to say how they all interrelate. So the reason people have shied away from it is because it essentially says the only way you're going to approach those problems is first consider them as an integrated whole. So I'm not disagreeing with that at all. There's a lot of debate about the art, but that wasn't the focus of what I was talking about today.
Thanks. I like the balls also. Could you draw some balls that you think characterize a modern McConnell and Brew introductory textbook? In their initial presentation, it says economics is a positive science or whatever, which describes the way the world is. And then there's this little normative branch that they never really get to. And when economic science fails, the overarching... That's what I was
Okay, here's my description of McConnell and Brew.
How did we get to that? Mainstream textbooks.
Again, textbooks are money-making propositions. You look at what will sell. There is no sense that they are really trying to find and clarify things.
With any exceptions.
Surely you accept your own.
This is very helpful for lots of reasons, but let me just ask one very narrow question. Coase's dinner, is that 1960? Okay.
1959, I think.
Okay.
60.
Well, because...
David, for the room, explain what you mean.
There is a...
Published in 1960, but I think the actual dinner...
In the paper, Dave talks briefly about a famous dinner, famous in some circles, where Coase was invited to Chicago to explain a mistake in a paper. And at the beginning of the dinner, or the discussion, everybody in Chicago agreed that it was a mistake. And then after Freedman tried to persuade Coase of the mistake, Freedman flipped over. And at the end of the dinner, everybody agreed with Coase.
Yeah. Although they, as Ronald himself has said on a great many occasions, they got what he was saying wrong.
No, that's right. And that's going to be the sort of the background of the question. the Coase theorem, which has not a lot to do with Coase, comes out of Stigler in his price theory textbook. It's a strong specification that transactions cost are zero. Okay, that's fine, except for Stigler. And here's the problem with Stigler, because in 1961, in a paper which basically won a Nobel Prize, so it is taken somewhat seriously, the active ingredient is that transactions costs are positive. It's the search theory paper, because you've got transactions cost of zero, you don't get a distribution of prices, you get a point mass. Right? There's one price in the market with transactions cost of zero, there's a distribution of prices in the market with a positive transaction cost. Okay, now any two individuals can hold the different views. Transactions cost are positive, transactions cost are zero. Yeah, that's no problem at all. But having Stigler hold the same view on a year apart, or maybe a year and a half apart, is, shall we say, remarkable. And I'm sure he was aware that a positive number is not the same as a zero. and probably more than anybody else. And so, is this difference between what he did at the most serious level of scientific work, right? The positive transactions cost, the distribution of prices. But on the other hand, on the stuff you're very seriously working on, the zero transactions cost is there for another purpose. It's not that way of seeing what's going on. That in one dimension, it's useful to have zero transactions cost. In another dimension, it's useful to have a positive transaction cost. But in no dimension is it helpful to point out that those are different assumptions.
Why in no dimension is
Well,
it?
because then you're going to ask questions. People are going to ask questions. Well, why one here and not the other? You would think that when you're doing, because the Coase theorem is used to make the argument. George's Coase theorem is used to make the argument that if rules don't matter, right? Because whatever rules we got will negotiate to a deficiency. Okay? You would think that it's a lot harder to do arbitrage in rules than in markets.
Right.
And so that if you've got positive transactions cost in markets, you're going to have a distribution of prices which are going to persist. So there's no reason to believe that you're going to get the point mass which is necessary for efficiency, or the simple versions of efficiency. So that the fact that these are not, it's not the same assumptions. It's an assumption which has different purposes. But once people, and it's been real recently since I've noticed that there's a difference between assumptions, that once you start having people point out that those are not the same numbers, then the obvious reaction is pick one. Or define why it's cheaper to arbitrage in non-market settings than it is to arbitrage in market settings.
I guess if again, if you treat it as engineering, everything's a heuristic. You can choose different assumptions for different particular problems, and you will. The difference is you don't then immediately move to a policy conclusion. As long as you're not moving to policy conclusions, you explore all kinds of different models. And including in the analysis is exactly what you're saying. Sort of now I've got to choose among models, sort of there, what fits for the particular element. And there is none of the absolute. I believe that Stigler sort of felt we wanted to save the market, so I've got to make it sound as this is pretty absolute. And then pushed it further and had problems that you're suggesting. So that's my own sense.
Jim?
One autobiographical detail. In 1948, several of us had finished our course requirements and prelims around Chicago, still there, and they hired Lloyd Metzler to come in. And we decided we'd audit his course in international. So we went in the course, and this is literally true. Metzler went to the blackboard And he said, well, there's one type of economics taught in the rest of the world and another type taught in Chicago. My job is to tell you what is being taught in the rest of the world. But that prompts this point that I'm making about your discussion. It seems to me in your whole discussion you miss a very important variable here, namely you're assuming, or presuming rather, that their economics is economics throughout in general. Now, I think there's a categorical difference that has, through old New everything else at Chicago and the rest of it, and Harvard, Yale, Ivy League type. It seems to me that you could not, and we're all vulnerable to wherever we have to be. Columbia may be different, but it seems to me that graduate students, all this whole period, have gone through Harvard, Yale, Princeton. It would have been very difficult not to adopt the stance, well, ultimately I'm advising the government. Ultimately, I'm advising the government what it's going to do, and it's going to listen to it. Chicago has never been that. It's always, I'm just trying to see what's going on. And in a sense, it fits more science, but I think that sort of encompasses this science, art, that you're talking about. This difference between the, what do they call it, fresh water and salt water economics.
I love the example. I think there is a sense that, Chicago, was really more about science in some sense, and the other was about policy, because they thought policy blended with science. And, so therefore, it was, Chicago said it was about science, but there was pretty clear they were making policy recommendations to their students. So if you were to ask the Chicago student, what should, as I did, sort of in the 80s where we did a summary, 100% of the Chicago students felt that, sort of to control inflation, the government should control, the money supply. I think 2% of Yale students felt that. So when there's those differences about policy judgments, something's being taught at both schools. And I can say that which is being taught is not meeting the level of science. Because the level of science I'd expect would have, if you're only worried about the truth, and they're both equally paying schools, you should pretty much get the same results at both schools as to what the policy views are. If you're getting different policy views at different schools, then I think that's an a priori assumption that they're not just teaching science.
My name is Verena Heismeyer. What you said before, that you want students to be problem solvers, is exactly the same what Robert Solow told me in an interview. And his set image is exactly this of an engineer, with his modeling including elements of arts, and I would add elements of a craft, and also his self-image as a teacher. And he said that as opposed to Chicago hardcore attitude, people at MIT preferred teaching as a very friendly thing to do, and they preferred an atmosphere, a family atmosphere. And he said that this was the most important part of his work. So what I was wondering is that I think that Solow and MIT are a very important part of what you called the Yale-Harvard nexus. And I wonder why you didn't mention him or MIT at all. And because I think it's a very specific way of doing economics and of doing teaching in economics.
In the period I was talking about, MIT really only started, sort of a bit later, so they were close to the end, but it would have, come in there. I've had a number of debates with Solow, sort of on, the sets of things, and he talks such an absolutely beautiful game. Sort of I agree with him completely on most of what he says. However, in terms of when it comes down to it, sort of here, my problem solvers deal with highly uncertain problems, which means you have to include ambiguity. As soon as the models start to include ambiguity, Robert Solow backs away and says we need something more definite. And therefore, here it's really, he considers applied economics to be applied science. Strongly believes that. And believes here we have little models that are telling us what to do. They're not the big models telling us what to do, but the little models are telling us what to do. And until we have that little model, we don't have any guide for policy. The difference, what I'm saying, is we've got to have guides for policy without those little models. And a lot of times those little models sort of include ideological sort of points of view that sort of put the policy result and take it out of discussion when it should be part of the discussion. So that's really the distinction I have, sort of between myself and Bob Solow. And in one of the first books I did, I sort of described my dilemma of first having started as a person who went into economics because he was really excited about Chicago economics. Sort of following it. I sat in on Becker's graduate courses as an undergrad and sort of took it and said, here, this is really good, it tells you everything. And then realizing it really doesn't tell you everything. It doesn't tell you a whole lot. So then you turn to MIT, which has these little models that say, here, this works, and not believing that tells me everything either. And sort of struggling for something, in between that would use both of them, but only when appropriate. And that's, sort of this broader sense of here, ultimately, judgment reigns, and we can't get away from that. Whereas, sort of Solow wants to sort of limit, the judgment as confined by it. Now, he and I have debated this, and he says, yes, sort of, but the best way to make sure we have people who have the analytic structure to be able to make the judgments you want is to see that they have this education. And I can see that's a legitimate argument. But you want the education not for the learning of the models itself, but simply as a selection process as to whose judgment we will be allowing to use.
I'm going to draw this to a close just so that we have enough time to have lunch and so on. I do know that Dan had another comment, but maybe he can talk to privately. I do want to ask whether the debate was for a case of Booker's bourbon, which I know it was. So I want to thank all of you for a wonderful morning, and we can have lunch in the dining hall, which is just a short walk from here, and we'll begin promptly at 1 o'clock this afternoon, so we'll be right on time.
Okay, so
Papers are okay, but don't leave a bag.
Just to give me a mark,